I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It's a quiet place with only a few neighbors nearby. Most nights, I enjoy the silence. It helps me unwind after a long day at work. But one night, the silence became something different, something unsettling. It was a Friday evening, and I had just returned home from work. I remember it was cold outside, with a drizzle that made everything look gray. I locked the front door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and headed to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I planned to spend the night watching TV and maybe reading a book after eating. I settled onto the couch with a blanket wrapped around me. I flipped through the channels but couldn't find anything interesting, so I decided to watch a movie I had seen a dozen times before. It was comforting knowing what was going to happen next. Halfway through the movie, I started feeling drowsy. My eyelids grew heavy, and I began to doze off. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. At first, I thought it might be the wind or maybe a branch rubbing against the wall, but then I heard it again, this time closer to the window. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. My heart started to race as I listened closely. The scratching sound continued, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like the wind anymore. I muted the TV, and the silence in the room grew thick and heavy. The sound moved to the back door, and I realized someone was trying to get in. I stayed frozen on the couch, not knowing what to do. I didn't have any weapons, and my phone was on the kitchen counter, too far away to reach without making noise. My mind raced, thinking of all the possibilities. Maybe it was just an animal. I tried to convince myself. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then the back door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get inside. Fear gripped me as I silently slipped off the couch. I moved slowly, careful not to make any noise, and crept toward the kitchen to grab my phone. I knew I had to call the police, but I also knew that any sound might alert whoever was outside. As I reached the kitchen, I heard the door creak open. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the back door was unlocked. I had forgotten to lock it when I came home. I cursed myself for being so careless. I grabbed my phone and ducked behind the kitchen counter, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. I could hear someone stepping into the house, their footsteps slow and deliberate. They were inside. The 911 operator answered, but I didn't dare speak. I could only listen as the person moved through the house, checking each room. The footsteps were getting closer, heading toward the kitchen. I whispered my address to the operator, barely audible, and then hung up, hoping the police would arrive in time. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. But then, the person stepped into the kitchen. I could see their shadow on the floor, moving closer to where I was hiding. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait to be discovered. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. I spotted a heavy frying pan on the stove and slowly reached for it, trying not to make a sound. Just as I grabbed the handle, the intruder turned the corner and saw me. Our eyes locked for a brief second, and I saw the cold, menacing look in his eyes. He was a tall man dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled over his head. He looked dangerous, like someone who wouldn't hesitate to hurt me without thinking. I swung the frying pan as hard as I could. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man stumbled back, clutching his head. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I bolted out of the kitchen and ran toward the front door. As I reached the door, I heard the man getting up behind me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I could hear him coming closer, his footsteps quick and angry. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw it open. I ran outside into the cold night, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I glanced back to see if he was following me, but the street was empty. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Moments later, I heard sirens in the distance. The police arrived and searched the house, but the intruder was gone. They told me I was lucky to have escaped unharmed, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt shaken, violated, and terrified. That night changed everything. I never felt safe in that house again. The silence that I once found comforting had become a constant reminder of how vulnerable I was, and every time I heard a noise, no matter how small, my heart would race, fearing that the intruder had returned. I used to work long hours in a small, stuffy office, staring at a computer screen until my eyes burned. Weekends were my only escape, and I would head to the mountains for some fresh air and solitude. I loved hiking, especially in the dense forests where the sounds of the city couldn't reach me. The forest was my sanctuary, a place where I could clear my mind and feel alive. One weekend, I decided to explore a new trail that I had heard about from a friend. It was said to be challenging and less traveled, perfect for someone like me who wanted to avoid the crowds. The weather was cool, and the skies were clear when I arrived at the trailhead. I packed enough supplies for the day, confident that I could handle whatever the forest threw at me. The trail was beautiful, winding through thick trees and over rocky terrain. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was in another world. I saw no other hikers, and the silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. After a few hours of hiking, I reached a fork in the trail. One path was clearly marked, but the others seemed to lead deeper into the forest where the trees grew closer together, and the light barely reached the ground. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take the unmarked path. I told myself I would explore it for a short distance and then turn back. The trail became more difficult as I moved forward, and soon it disappeared altogether. I should have turned back then, but I was intrigued by the sense of adventure, the unknown. I pushed on, not realizing how far off course I was until it was too late. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken, and I realized I was lost. I had no idea which direction the main trail was in, and panic started to set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same in the fading light. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the silence that I had once found comforting now felt oppressive. I walked for what felt like hours, calling out occasionally, hoping that someone might hear me, but there was no response. My legs grew tired, and I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. Just as I was about to give up hope, I spotted something through the trees, a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. Relief washed over me as I approached the cabin, thinking that I had found help. The structure was old, with weathered wood and a sagging roof, but it was shelter. As I got closer, I noticed the faint glow of a fire through the small window. I knocked on the door, hoping that whoever lived there would be kind enough to offer me a place to stay for the night. The door creaked open, and an old man stood before me. He was ragged, with long, unkempt hair and a beard that nearly reached his chest. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were wild like those of a cornered animal. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me as if he hadn't seen another person in years. "Please," I said, "I'm lost. I need help." The man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place is not for you. Leave now while you still can." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I was too exhausted to leave. "I don't know where to go," I replied. "Please, just let me stay here for the night." He shook his head slowly. "If you stay, you won't make it out. This is my domain, and I don't take kindly to intruders." Despite his warning, I was desperate. I thanked him and backed away, deciding to set up camp nearby rather than stay in the cabin. I found a small clearing not far from the cabin where I pitched my tent and built a small fire. The night was unnervingly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drifted off to sleep eventually, only to be woken in the early hours of the morning by an unsettling sensation. I crawled out of my tent and immediately noticed something strange. The trees surrounding my campsite had strange symbols carved into their trunks. The symbols were unfamiliar, and they filled me with a sense of dread. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I caught a glimpse of movement in the distance. It was the old man, standing among the trees, watching me. He was too far away to make out his expression, but I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking and cold. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, like a shadow in the woods, always at the edge of my vision, no matter which direction I turned. He was there, watching, but never approaching. Fear gripped me, and I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I had to get out of there. But no matter which way I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, like prey being stalked by a predator. The symbols on the trees became more frequent, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. I tried to run, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, disorienting me further. Every time I thought I was putting distance between myself and the old man, he would appear again, always at the edge of the trees, always watching. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way to escape, but it was no use. I was trapped in his domain, and the forest was his ally. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was never going to leave this place. The old man had warned me, and I had ignored him. Now I was paying the price. As the sun began to set, I knew my time was running out. The symbols, the old man, the oppressive silence, it was all too much. I stumbled through the trees, my strength fading, my hope dwindling. Finally, I collapsed, too exhausted to continue. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the old man standing over me, his wild eyes gleaming in the fading light. He didn't need to speak. I knew what was coming. I had entered his domain, and I would never leave. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was 18, working as a pizza delivery driver to help pay for college. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was easy enough, and the tips weren't bad. Most nights were uneventful, just me driving around delivering pizzas and listening to music. But one night was different, one I'll never forget. It started like any other shift. I picked up a few orders and loaded them into my car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. The weather was calm, and the streets were quiet, which made for smooth driving. As I turned onto a long stretch of road, I noticed something strange far ahead. A car was speeding toward me, but its headlights were off. The car was barely visible, just a shadow moving fast. My heart jumped as I realized how close it was. I swerved hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a collision. The car zoomed past me, still with no headlights, and disappeared into the night. My hands were shaking, but I kept driving, trying to brush it off as just a careless driver. A few hours later, I had another delivery. The address was in a quiet neighborhood with narrow streets and old houses lined up close together. I pulled up to the house, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the door. As I stood there, waiting for someone to answer, I heard the sound of an engine behind me. I turned around and saw the same car from earlier parked across the street. The headlights were on this time, but the car just sat there idling. I felt a chill run down my spine. The door behind me opened, and I handed over the pizza, trying to act normal, but my mind was focused on that car. After the transaction, I walked back to my car, glancing over my shoulder. The other car hadn't moved, but I could feel eyes on me. As I got into my car and started the engine, the other car suddenly roared to life. It sped toward me, stopping just inches away from my front bumper. The driver, a man with a shaved head and a scowl, leaned out the window. His eyes were cold, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger maybe, or something darker. "Watch where you're going," he snarled. His voice was harsh, filled with a venom that made my stomach twist. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at him, frozen. The man seemed to take my silence as a challenge. "You think you're tough, huh?" he growled. "You think you can just cut me off?" Before I could respond, he slammed his hand against the side of his car. The loud bang echoed in the empty street. I snapped out of my daze, realizing I needed to get out of there. I put the car in gear and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. But he wasn't done. The man's car screeched as he hit the gas, chasing after me. The narrow street seemed to close in on me as I tried to escape. I took sharp turns, cutting through alleyways and side streets, hoping to lose him, but he was relentless, sticking close behind me. The chase felt like it lasted forever. My palms were sweaty, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I could hear the roar of his engine and see his headlights in my rearview mirror, getting closer and closer. I didn't know these streets well, but I used every bit of driving skill I had to stay ahead, narrowly avoiding parked cars and tight corners. Finally, after what felt like hours, I spotted an open area up ahead, a small park with a road that looped around it. I made a sharp turn into the loop, and as soon as I was out of sight, I killed my headlights and pulled over to the side, hiding behind some bushes. I held my breath as the other car sped past, the driver unaware that I had tricked him. For a few moments, I sat there in the dark, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't dare move, afraid he might circle back. After a while, the sound of his engine faded, and I was left alone with the distant hum of crickets. I didn't see the car again for the rest of the night, but the fear lingered. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see those headlights, to hear that engine roaring behind me. I finished my deliveries, but I was on edge, my eyes constantly scanning the road. A few nights later, I was on another delivery when I saw the car again. It was parked at the edge of a neighborhood, partially hidden by shadows. My stomach twisted as I drove past, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But as soon as I passed, the car pulled out and started following me. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the road ahead, but my mind was racing. I needed to find a way to shake him, but there was no one around, no one I could ask for help. The streets were deserted, and the fear that had been gnawing at me for days finally took hold. As I pulled up to the next house, I saw a man standing on the porch, waiting for his pizza. Desperation took over, and I ran up to him, practically shoving the pizza into his hands. "Please," I whispered, glancing back at the car. "Can you help me?" The man's eyes widened as he took in my panic. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and pulled out his phone. I could see the other car stopped at the end of the street, the driver watching us closely. I felt trapped, like a rabbit caught in a snare. The man spoke to the police, giving them our location. While I stood there, trying not to look too scared, it felt like hours before I heard the distant wail of sirens. The car at the end of the street suddenly roared to life and sped off, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. When the police arrived, I told them everything, but the man was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but I knew he was out there somewhere, waiting. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I got behind the wheel, I was on edge, looking for that car, for that driver. I never saw him again, but the fear never left me. The memory of those headlights, of that chase through the narrow streets, stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to something terrible. I work the night shift at a small motel on the edge of a quiet town. It's the kind of place where nothing much happens, where the only sounds at night are the hum of the vending machine and the occasional car passing by on the highway. I'm used to the stillness and solitude, and I've always found comfort in the quiet hours when the world seems to be asleep. But lately, something strange has been happening during my shifts. It started about a week ago. I was sitting at the reception desk, flipping through an old magazine when the phone rang. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 3 a.m., an odd time for anyone to be calling. I picked up the receiver and said, "Front desk, how can I help you?" But there was no answer. Instead, I heard a strange noise, like heavy breathing coming from the other end of the line. I waited for a moment, thinking maybe someone had accidentally dialed the motel, but the breathing continued. It was slow and steady, almost rhythmic, but there was something off about it. It made my skin crawl. "Hello, is anyone there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The breathing stopped, replaced by a faint sound of footsteps, as if someone was walking slowly across a wooden floor. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the line went dead. I hung up the phone, feeling a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Prank calls happen sometimes, especially at night. Maybe it was just a bored teenager trying to scare me. The next night, the phone rang again at almost the same time. This time, there was no breathing, but I could hear whispers, soft and unintelligible like a distant conversation. I couldn't quite make out the words. My heart started to race as I listened, trying to catch any words, but the whispers were too quiet, too far away. Then, the sound of footsteps came again, growing louder and louder until it felt like they were right in the room with me. I quickly hung up, my hands trembling. I checked the motel's registry to see if any guests had checked in that night, but the only rooms occupied were the ones I already knew about. The other rooms were supposed to be empty. But when I looked at the phone's display, it showed that the call had come from one of those vacant rooms, room 206. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The next few nights, the calls continued. Each time, the noises were different. Sometimes it was the sound of a door creaking open. Other times, it was the faint hum of a music box playing an old, haunting tune. But the calls always came from a different empty room, and each time I checked the rooms after the calls, I found nothing. The beds were made, the lights were off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. A chair slightly moved, a curtain drawn just a little too far, small things that didn't add up. By the end of the week, I was on edge. Every time the phone rang, my heart would skip a beat, and I would brace myself for whatever unsettling sound would come through the receiver. I started to dread the long, lonely hours of my shift, fearing what might happen next. One night, after another call from an empty room, I decided to investigate further. I had to know where these calls were coming from. I grabbed the master key from the desk and made my way to the room that had just been called. Room 301. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as I approached the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob before finally turning the key and pushing the door open. The room was dark and cold. I flicked on the light, and the small lamp on the nightstand cast an eerie glow across the room. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The phone on the nightstand was slightly off the hook, just enough to break the connection. I felt a shiver run through me as I reached out to hang it up properly. As I did, I noticed a piece of paper sticking out from under the phone. I picked it up and unfolded it, revealing a list of names I didn't recognize. At the bottom of the list, one word was written in red ink: help. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I knew I had to talk to the motel owner, Mr. Charles, about this. Maybe he could explain what was happening and why these calls kept coming from rooms that were supposed to be empty. The next evening, I approached him as soon as he arrived for his shift. I told him about the calls, the noises, and the strange things I'd found in the rooms. For a moment, he looked startled, his face pale, but he quickly composed himself. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Just some old wiring issues, probably. I'll take care of it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. That night, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering what he wasn't telling me. Then, just as I was about to leave my shift, the phone rang one last time. I answered it, my hand trembling. The line was silent at first, but then I heard a faint, familiar voice, the voice of Mr. Charles. It was coming from a room that wasn't supposed to be rented out. A room at the very end of the hallway that I'd never seen anyone enter or leave, room 308. I dropped the phone and ran, not stopping until I was outside under the pale light of the moon. I never went back to that motel again. Whatever was in that room, it was something far darker than I could ever understand. I was 18, working as a pizza delivery driver to help pay for college. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was easy enough, and the tips weren't bad. Most nights were uneventful, just me driving around delivering pizzas and listening to music. But one night was different, one I'll never forget. It started like any other shift. I picked up a few orders and loaded them into my car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. The weather was calm, and the streets were quiet, which made for smooth driving. As I turned onto a long stretch of road, I noticed something strange far ahead. A car was speeding toward me, but its headlights were off. The car was barely visible, just a shadow moving fast. My heart jumped as I realized how close it was. I swerved hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a collision. The car zoomed past me, still with no headlights, and disappeared into the night. My hands were shaking, but I kept driving, trying to brush it off as just a careless driver. A few hours later, I had another delivery. The address was in a quiet neighborhood with narrow streets and old houses lined up close together. I pulled up to the house, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the door. As I stood there, waiting for someone to answer, I heard the sound of an engine behind me. I turned around and saw the same car from earlier parked across the street. The headlights were on this time, but the car just sat there idling, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door behind me opened, and I handed over the pizza, trying to act normal, but my mind was focused on that car. After the transaction, I walked back to my car, glancing over my shoulder. The other car hadn't moved, but I could feel eyes on me. As I got into my car and started the engine, the other car suddenly roared to life. It sped toward me, stopping just inches away from my front bumper. The driver, a man with a shaved head and a scowl, leaned out the window. His eyes were cold, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger maybe, or something darker. "Watch where you're going," he snarled. His voice was harsh, filled with a venom that made my stomach twist. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at him, frozen. The man seemed to take my silence as a challenge. "You think you're tough, huh?" he growled. "You think you can just cut me off?" Before I could respond, he slammed his hand against the side of his car. The loud bang echoed in the empty street. I snapped out of my daze, realizing I needed to get out of there. I put the car in gear and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. But he wasn't done. The man's car screeched as he hit the gas, chasing after me. The narrow street seemed to close in on me as I tried to escape. I took sharp turns, cutting through alleyways and side streets, hoping to lose him, but he was relentless, sticking close behind me. It sounded like something, or someone, was inside the box. I turned to the man, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" he replied, his tone flat and emotionless. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I thought I heard something from the back seat," I said. "Just the road noise," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. My heart was racing, and a cold sweat had broken out on the back of my neck. The muffled sounds from the box were growing louder, and I was starting to feel panicked. I needed to get out of the car. I glanced at the door handle, my mind racing. We were on a deserted stretch of road with no other cars in sight. If I jumped out now, I might get hurt, or worse, but staying in the car didn't feel like a safe option either. As I weighed my options, the man started to hum softly. It was a low, eerie tune, and it sent shivers down my spine. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I could see the tendons in his hands straining. The humming grew louder and more frantic, and I knew I had to do something. I reached for my phone, trying to be discreet, but the man saw me. His eyes flashed with anger, and he reached over to grab my wrist. "No phones," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. I yanked my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. The car was still moving, and the man's grip on the steering wheel was so tight that his knuckles were white. The strange sounds from the back seat were growing louder and more desperate, and I knew I couldn't stay in the car any longer. I took a deep breath, unbuckled my seatbelt, and reached for the door handle. The man noticed what I was doing and let out a low growl. "Don't even think about it," he warned, but I didn't listen. I pulled the door handle and pushed the door open, the rush of cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The man tried to grab me, but I was quicker. I threw myself out of the car, hitting the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I rolled across the asphalt, feeling the rough surface scrape against my skin. The car screeched to a stop, and I heard the man shouting, but I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet and started running. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to keep moving. The cold night air burned my lungs, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting as far away from that car as possible. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing by the side of the road, gasping for breath. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I looked back down the road, half expecting to see the car coming after me, but it was gone. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and trying to calm down. Eventually, a passing car stopped, and the driver, a kind woman, offered to take me to the nearest town. I hesitated, my fear of getting into another stranger's car almost overwhelming, but I had no other choice. As we drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the box in the back seat of that man's car. What was inside it? What had I heard? I'll never know for sure, but I'm grateful that I escaped that night. I never hitchhiked again. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to go on a weekend hiking trip. We were all college students, eager to escape the stress of exams and enjoy some time in nature. There were 4 of us: Jason, Lena, Alex, and me. We had planned this trip for weeks, picking out a forest known for its beautiful trails and peaceful surroundings. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. We arrived early on a Saturday morning, excited and full of energy. The air was fresh, the sky was clear, and the forest looked inviting. We parked our car at the entrance of the trail and started our hike, chatting and laughing as we made our way deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. As the day went on, we lost track of time. We took breaks to explore interesting spots, like a small stream that we found hidden behind some bushes and a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the forest below. The hours slipped by, and before we knew it, the sun began to set. "Maybe we should start heading back," Lena suggested, glancing at her watch. "It's getting late." I nodded in agreement. We all knew that hiking in the dark was not a good idea, especially in a forest this dense. We turned around and began walking back the way we had come, but something was off. The path didn't look familiar. The trees seemed different, and the more we walked, the more we realized we were lost. Panic started to set in as the daylight faded. We tried to stay calm, reassuring each other that we would find the trail eventually, but as the last light of the sun disappeared and darkness settled in, our confidence began to wane. The forest at night was a different place altogether. The shadows grew longer, and the once friendly trees now seemed menacing. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves that had been soothing earlier now felt ominous. We took out our flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, but it was like trying to see through a thick fog. Everything looked the same, and there was no sign of the trail. As we continued to wander, the forest seemed to close in around us. The night air was cool, and a thick silence hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our feet. That's when we first heard it, the sound of footsteps. At first, we thought it was just an echo of our steps, but it quickly became clear that the sound was coming from behind us. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone or something was following us. We stopped, and the footsteps stopped too. We looked at each other, fear flickering in our eyes. Alex was the first to speak. "Did you guys hear that?" None of us answered, but the look on our faces said it all. We stood there, listening. But the footsteps had stopped. After a moment, we convinced ourselves it was just our imagination and started walking again. But the footsteps returned, matching our pace perfectly. Every time we stopped, they stopped. When we started again, they followed. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was there, watching us. Our pace quickened as fear began to creep into our minds. We whispered to each other, trying to stay calm, but it was clear that none of us knew what to do. The footsteps were getting closer, and the darkness around us felt suffocating. Suddenly, Jason, who was leading the way, froze in place. His flashlight beam was fixed on something ahead of us, and when we followed his gaze, we saw him. A man stood just a few feet away, barely visible through the trees. He was tall, his clothes blending into the shadows, making him almost invisible. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. We didn't wait to see what he wanted. Without a word, we turned and ran. The forest became a blur of darkness and fear as we stumbled over roots and branches, desperate to get away. But no matter how far or fast we ran, the man was always there, just out of reach, watching us. It was like we were running in circles, the forest never changing, the man never far behind. Our fear turned into full-blown panic as we realized we were being herded deeper into the woods. The footsteps never ceased, and every time we thought we had lost him, he would appear again, closer than before. Our exhaustion began to take its toll. We were breathing heavily, our legs aching from the relentless running, but we couldn't stop. The forest was no longer a place of beauty, but a labyrinth of terror. The man's silent pursuit felt like a nightmare we couldn't escape. Then, without warning, Lena screamed. She had tripped over something and fallen hard to the ground. I rushed to help her, but as I reached down, I saw what had caused her to fall. A thin wire stretched across the path, barely visible in the dim light. It was a trap, deliberately placed to catch us. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me. This man wasn't just following us, he was toying with us, leading us into traps he had set. The forest wasn't just a random place, it was his hunting ground. With Lena back on her feet, we continued our desperate escape, but now we were even more cautious. Every step could lead to another trap, every shadow could hide another snare. The man was relentless, always one step ahead, always waiting. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally. Our hope of finding our way back had vanished, replaced by the primal need to survive. The man never spoke and never came closer, but his presence was a constant, oppressive force that drove us deeper into fear. Finally, we could run no more. We collapsed in a small clearing, our bodies shaking with exhaustion and terror. The footsteps had stopped again, but we knew he was still out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment. As we huddled together, too terrified to move, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trapped, that the forest itself had become our prison. The man had driven us to the brink of madness, and there was no way out. We had lost the battle before it even began. At that moment, I realized something chilling. We were not just lost in the forest, we were lost to it. The man had won, and we were at his mercy. I used to work as a security guard at an old abandoned factory. It was a large, crumbling building with broken windows and rusted machinery that hadn't been used in years. The factory had been closed for decades, but the owners still wanted someone to keep an eye on it. I used to work as a security guard at an old abandoned factory. It was a large, crumbling building with broken windows and rusted machinery that hadn't been used in years. The factory had been closed for decades, but the owners still wanted someone to keep an eye on it at night. Maybe they thought someone might try to steal scrap metal or break in for some other reason. Either way, they hired me to work the night shift. The first few nights were uneventful. I would walk through the long, dark hallways, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was boring, but it was an easy job. I would listen to the radio or read a book to pass the time. But then things started to change. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. One night, I noticed that a door I had closed earlier was now slightly ajar. I thought maybe I had just forgotten to shut it properly, so I didn't think much of it. But then it happened again the next night. This time, I was sure I had closed the door tightly, but when I walked by it later, it was open again. I began to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off. It was an old building after all. Maybe the door didn't latch correctly, or maybe the wind had blown it open. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about, but then I started hearing noises. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was making my rounds through the factory when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the storage rooms. It was so quiet that at first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Soft, shuffling noises like someone moving around in the dark. I froze, listening carefully. My heart began to pound in my chest. I was alone in this place. There shouldn't be anyone else here. I slowly made my way to the storage room, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling stopped as I approached, and when I reached the door, I found it closed. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then pushed the door open. The room was empty. I shone my flashlight around, checking every corner, but there was nothing there, no sign of anyone, no reason for the noise. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few nights were worse. The noises continued, but they grew louder and more frequent. Footsteps echoed down the hallways when I was sure I was alone. The sound of something scraping against the concrete floor, like metal being dragged. I even heard what sounded like whispering, but when I tried to follow the sound, it would stop abruptly, leaving me in eerie silence. I started to see things too, shadows darting just out of the corner of my eye, a glimpse of movement in a darkened hallway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I was on edge, constantly jumping at every little sound, my nerves frayed. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was in the factory with me, but what? I had no idea. I decided to set up some cameras to catch whatever or whoever was causing all of this. I placed them in the areas where I had seen the most movement and heard the most noise. If someone was sneaking into the factory, I was going to catch them on tape. The next night, I went about my usual rounds, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. When my shift was over, I went back to the small security office to review the footage. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as I hit play, the screen flickering to life. At first, there was nothing unusual, just empty hallways and silent rooms. But then, in one of the camera feeds, I saw it, a figure moving through the factory, just on the edge of the frame. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I watched, horrified, as the figure moved through the building, always staying just out of the camera's full view. It seemed to know exactly where the cameras were and avoided them, never showing its face. But I could tell it wasn't human, the way it moved, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows. It was something else, something terrifying. The figure appeared on almost every camera feed, always lurking in the background, always watching. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized that it had been following me throughout the night, staying just out of sight, waiting for me to notice it. I knew I had to confront it. I couldn't keep working here, not with that thing inside the factory. But as I stood up, ready to leave, I heard it, a loud crashing sound coming from the hallway, just outside the office. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the door. The hallway was dark, the air thick with tension. I could hear my breathing, shallow and quick, as I stepped out of the office. The sound had come from down the hall, near one of the old storage rooms. I made my way toward it, every step feeling like it took an eternity. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become, like the temperature was dropping, the deeper I went into the factory. When I reached the storage room, I saw that the door was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it into the room. It was empty, just like before, but this time, there was something different. Carved into the concrete floor in deep, jagged lines were symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. My skin crawled as I realized that whatever had made those marks wasn't human. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I felt it, a presence behind me, cold and malevolent. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the hallway, and there it was, the figure from the footage, standing just a few feet away, its face hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing wildly as I made for the exit. I could hear the thing behind me, its footsteps slow and deliberate, like it knew I couldn't escape. I burst out of the factory and into the cold night air, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that cursed place. I never went back to the factory. I quit the job the next day, leaving behind my uniform and keys. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it was waiting for someone to find it, and I was unlucky enough to be that person. I used to work for a delivery company. My job was simple: drop off packages and collect payments. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. I mostly worked during the day, but sometimes when business was slow, I took extra shifts at night. That was when things got risky. One night, I was given a delivery in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. The houses were old, and the streets were quiet, too quiet. As I drove through the area, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off, but I pushed the thought aside. After all, it was just another delivery. When I arrived at the address, the house looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark. I double-checked the address on the package. It matched. I took a deep breath and grabbed the package. As I walked up to the door, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, it creaked open. I saw two men standing there. They were smaller than me, but something about them made me nervous. One of them had a gun, and before I could react, they grabbed me. The force of their pull knocked me off balance, and I stumbled into the parlor room. They slammed the door shut behind me. The room was dimly lit, with old furniture and a musty smell that filled my nose. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but before I could even speak, they pushed me to the floor. My heart raced as they stood over me. The one with the gun waved it in my face, making it clear who was in control. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead as I looked up at them. There was no way out. The room seemed to close in on me, making breathing hard. They didn't waste any time. One of them kicked me in the side, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for air, but before I could recover, the other man punched me in the face. Pain shot through my jaw, and I tasted blood. My vision blurred as they continued to beat me. Each hit felt like a hammer to my body, leaving me helpless on the floor. As I lay there, trying to protect myself, I felt their hands searching through my pockets. They pulled out my wallet and emptied it. Every dollar I had earned was gone in seconds. They didn't stop there. They searched my jacket, taking whatever they could find. When they were done, they stepped back. I tried to sit up, but the pain was too much. My body ached from the beating, and I could feel bruises forming. But the worst was yet to come. The man with the gun leaned down and grabbed me by the collar. He pulled me close, his breath hot against my face. "If you tell anyone," he hissed, "we'll find you, and we'll find your family. We'll kill you all. Do you understand?" I nodded weakly, too scared to speak. The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating me. They weren't just robbing me, they were controlling me, keeping me silent out of fear. The thought of my family in danger was worse than the pain they had inflicted on me. Satisfied with my answer, they let go of me and walked away. I heard the door open and close as they left me there, broken and alone. For a long time I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. Eventually I managed to get up. Every movement hurt, but I forced myself to stand. I knew I had to leave that place. I didn't want to be there when they decided to come back. I stumbled out of the house and into the cool night air. The streets were still quiet, but now they felt even more ominous. I made my way to my car, each step a painful reminder of the beating I had taken. When I finally reached it, I collapsed into the driver's seat. I sat there for a while, trying to steady my breathing. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was becoming more intense. I didn't know what to do. I could go to the police, but their threat echoed. They knew where I lived, they knew about my family. The fear was overwhelming, so I made a decision I'm not proud of, but one I felt I had to make. I started the car and drove away. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't want to remember it, but as much as I tried, I couldn't escape what had happened. The fear stayed with me, gnawing at my mind. When I got home, I went straight to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was swollen, and my clothes were torn. I looked like a mess, but at least I was alive. I cleaned myself up as best as I could, trying to erase any trace of the night's events. But no matter how much I washed, I couldn't get rid of the feeling of their hands on me, the pain of their blows, or the fear of their threats. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went, reminding me of what could happen if I spoke up. The next day, I called in sick. I couldn't face going back to work, not after what had happened. I spent the day in bed, trying to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them standing over me, their faces twisted with malice. Days turned into weeks, and I slowly started to heal physically. The bruises faded and the pain lessened, but the fear never went away. I became more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting them to appear. I never told anyone what happened that night.